The blood stain on her dress had dried to a rust-brown color by the time Sarah Montgomery pushed open the heavy wooden door of the little whitewashed church outside Amarillo, Texas. Her trembling hands barely able to grip the iron handle as she stumbled into the cool darkness and collapsed onto the nearest pew. It was late September in 1883, and the autumn sun beat down mercilessly on the parched earth outside. But inside these walls, she found momentary refuge from both the heat and the terror that had been chasing her for 3 days straight. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pressed one hand to her swollen belly, feeling the child within her kick as if protesting their desperate flight, while her other hand clutched at the wooden seat to keep herself from sliding to the floor in exhaustion. She had been running since Monday morning when she had watched from behind the henhouse as 3 men shot her husband dead in their front yard, his body crumpling to the dust before he could even draw his weapon. And she knew with absolute certainty that they would come for her next, because of what Thomas had witnessed in town the week before. The baby inside her was 7 months along now, obvious beneath her torn and dirty traveling dress, and every jarring step of her desperate journey had sent sharp pains through her back and legs. She had walked through the night, hidden in a freight wagon during the day, and finally made her way on foot again until she spotted this small church standing alone on the prairie like a beacon of hope. Now she sat in the silence, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the walls, and allowed herself to weep for the first time since Thomas had fallen. Her tears came hot and bitter, running down her dust-caked cheeks and dripping onto her clasped hands. She was 22 years old, pregnant, widowed, and alone in a land that showed no mercy to women in her position. She had no family to turn to. Thomas had been her only living relative after they had married 2 years ago, and his family had disowned him for marrying a woman they considered beneath their station. The church offered no comfort beyond its shelter. There were no cushions on the pews, no decorations on the walls, just rough-hewn wood and whitewashed plaster and a simple cross above the altar. But it was quiet and it was safe, at least for now, and Sarah allowed herself to sink into that small grace. She stretched out on the pew, using her bundled shawl as a pillow, and closed her eyes against the tears that would not stop flowing. She must have slept, because when she opened her eyes again, the light slanting through the windows had changed from harsh white to soft gold, and she heard the sound of horse hooves outside. Panic seized her immediately, and she sat up too quickly, sending a wave of dizziness through her head. She pressed herself against the wall behind the pew, trying to make herself small and invisible, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The door creaked open and heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. Sarah held her breath, pressing both hands over her mouth to keep from making any sound. Through the gap between the pews she could see boots, worn leather with spurs that jingled softly with each step. A man's voice called out, deep and cautious. "Hello, someone in here?" She did not answer. Could not answer. Her throat had closed up with fear. The footsteps came closer and then stopped. There was a long pause, and then the voice spoke again, gentler this time. "I can hear you breathing, ma'am. I am not here to hurt you. I am just the man who looks after this church." Sarah's mind raced. Could she trust him? Could she trust anyone? But what choice did she have? She could not run anymore, not in her condition, not with the baby so heavy inside her and her body so exhausted from days without proper rest or food. Slowly, she raised her head above the back of the pew. The man standing in the aisle was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dusty range clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. As she looked at him, he reached up and removed the hat, revealing a weathered face with sun-creased eyes and dark hair touched with gray at the temples. He appeared to be somewhere in his early 30s, his features strong and honest-looking, though Sarah knew better than to trust appearances alone. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking from thirst and fear. "Please do not tell anyone I am here." The man's expression shifted from surprise to concern as he took in her condition, her torn dress, her obvious pregnancy, the desperate fear in her eyes. He held up one hand in a calming gesture and took a careful step back, giving her space. "I will not tell a soul," he said quietly. "My name is James Holloway. I run the ranch about 2 miles east of here, and I come to check on the church a few times a week since we do not have a regular preacher. Are you hurt? Do you need water?" At the mention of water, Sarah's parched throat seemed to close up entirely. She tried to speak, but could only nod. James immediately turned and strode back outside, returning moments later with a canteen. He approached slowly, as if she were a frightened animal that might bolt at any sudden movement, and held the canteen out to her. Sarah reached for it with shaking hands and raised it to her lips, drinking too fast and choking on the water. James waited patiently until she had finished, then took the canteen back and set it within her reach on the pew. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "Yesterday morning," Sarah admitted. "I had some bread, but it is gone now." James nodded slowly, his eyes taking in every detail of her appearance with a tracker's careful observation. "You are running from something or someone." It was not a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "They killed my husband, 3 men, I saw them do it." "If they find me," her voice broke and she could not continue. "They will not find you here," James said with quiet certainty. "Not if I have anything to say about it, but you cannot stay in the church. It is the first place anyone would look if they come asking questions. My ranch is not far. You would be safer there." "I do not know you," Sarah said, though even as she spoke the words she knew how foolish they sounded. She did not have the luxury of waiting to know someone. "No, you do not," James agreed. "But I am offering you shelter and protection, and judging by your condition, you need both." His eyes dropped to her swollen belly and something changed in his expression, a softness that had not been there before. "That baby deserves a home, ma'am, a safe place to be born. Let me give you that, at least until you figure out what comes next." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, bringing fresh tears to her eyes. That baby deserves a home. Such simple words, but they carried the weight of everything she had been trying not to think about for the past 3 days. How could she bring a child into the world when she had nothing? "No husband, no home, no safety, no future. I have no money," she said. "I cannot pay you for your help." "I am not asking for payment," James replied. "I am asking you to let me do the right thing." Sarah studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive, but she saw only honest concern and something else, something almost sad, as if he understood loss in a way that went beyond sympathy. She thought of the long night ahead, of the cold that would settle into the church once the sun went down, of the baby kicking inside her and the exhaustion that made her bones ache. "All right," she whispered. "All right." James visibly relaxed, as if he had been holding his breath waiting for her answer. "Can you walk? My horse is just outside." "I can walk," Sarah said, though in truth she was not certain. She pushed herself up from the pew, swaying on her feet, and James was immediately at her side, his hand under her elbow to steady her. He did not grab her or try to rush her, just offered his support and let her set the pace as they made their way slowly down the aisle and out into the golden afternoon light. His horse was a sturdy bay gelding that eyed Sarah with calm disinterest as James helped her mount. He swung up behind her, one arm coming around to hold her steady without being presumptuous, and clicked his tongue to set the horse in motion. The ride to the ranch was gentle and slow, James keeping the horse to a walk despite the failing light, and Sarah found herself leaning back against his solid warmth despite her determination to remain wary. The ranch, when it came into view, was modest but well-kept, a house of weathered wood with a covered porch, a barn, corrals, and a few outbuildings. Chickens scattered as they approached, and a dog came running, barking until it recognized James and dissolved into excited whining. James dismounted first, then reached up to help Sarah down, his hands careful on her waist. "This way," he said, guiding her toward the house. "You can have the bedroom, I will sleep in the barn." "I cannot take your bed," Sarah protested weakly. "You can and you will," James said firmly. A pregnant woman needs proper rest, not a pile of hay. Inside, the house was simple but clean, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living space, and 2 doors leading off to what Sarah assumed were bedrooms. James led her to the larger of the 2, revealing a room with a proper bed covered in quilts, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the prairie. "There is water in the pitcher," James said, pointing to the dresser. "I will bring you something to eat. Do you need anything else right now?" Sarah shook her head, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of a real bed and 4 walls. "Thank you," she managed. "I do not know how to thank you." "No need," James said. "Just rest." He left, closing the door quietly behind him, and Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed. The mattress was softer than anything she had felt in days, and the quilt smelled of sunshine and fresh air. She wanted to lie down immediately, to sink into sleep and forget everything, but her body was too dirty, too covered in dust and sweat and the evidence of her desperate flight. The water in the pitcher was clean and cool. Sarah poured some into the basin and used a cloth she found folded beside it to wash her face and hands, then her arms and neck. The simple act of cleaning away the grime made her feel almost human again. She was just finishing when there was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she called, and James entered carrying a tray with a plate of food, bread and cheese and cold chicken and a cup of milk. "It is not much," he said apologetically. "I was not expecting company." "It looks wonderful," Sarah said honestly, and she took the tray with hands that trembled slightly. She sat on the edge of the bed and ate slowly, forcing herself not to gulp the food down despite her hunger. James watched her for a moment, then nodded in satisfaction. "I will let you rest," he said. "If you need anything during the night, I will be in the barn. There is a bell on the porch. Just ring it and I will hear." After he left, Sarah finished her meal and then finally allowed herself to lie down. The bed enveloped her in comfort, and despite all her fears and worries, sleep claimed her almost immediately. She woke once during the night, disoriented and frightened until she remembered where she was. The baby was moving, turning somersaults inside her, and she pressed her hands to her belly and whispered soothing words. "We are safe," she told her child. "For now, we are safe." When she woke again, gray dawn light was seeping through the window, and she could hear the sounds of the ranch coming to life: chickens clucking, the dog barking, the lowing of cattle in the distance. She rose slowly, every muscle in her body protesting, and made use of the chamber pot in the corner before washing her face again. Her dress was filthy and torn, but it was all she had, so she smoothed it as best she could and opened the door. James was at the stove cooking something that smelled heavenly. He turned when he heard her and smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Good morning. How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in a long time," Sarah admitted. "Thank you again for your kindness." "Sit down," James said, gesturing to the table. "Breakfast will be ready in a moment." Sarah sat, watching as he moved competently around the kitchen, flipping bacon and stirring eggs. It was strange to see a man cooking. Thomas had never set foot in the kitchen if he could help it, but James seemed completely at ease with the task. "Do you live here alone?" Sarah asked. "Yes," James said, his voice neutral. "My wife died 4 years ago, fever. We had only been married a year." "I am sorry," Sarah said quietly, and she meant it. She understood now the sadness she had seen in his eyes, the recognition of loss. "It was a long time ago," James said, though his tone suggested it still hurt. "I learned to manage on my own. The ranch is small, but it supports me well enough." He brought plates to the table and they ate in companionable silence. The food was simple but well prepared, and Sarah felt strength returning to her body with each bite. When they had finished, James pushed his plate aside and looked at her seriously. "I need to know what you are running from," he said. "Not because I am going to turn you away, but because I need to know what to watch for. If men come looking, I need to be prepared." Sarah took a deep breath and told him everything: how her husband Thomas had worked as a clerk at the land office in town, How he had discovered that 3 prominent ranchers were using forged documents to claim land that rightfully belonged to homesteaders. How he had told her he was going to report it to the territorial marshal. She told him about the morning 3 days ago when the men had come, how Thomas had stepped out to meet them and how they had shot him down without warning or mercy. "I ran," she said, shame coloring her voice. "I did not even go to him, I just ran." "You did the right thing," James said firmly. "If you had gone to him, they would have killed you too and your baby with you. Your husband would have wanted you to run." "I do not even know if they saw me," Sarah continued. "I do not know if they know I exist. Thomas never talked about his work in town, he kept me away from it all." "But I was afraid." "Fear is good," James interrupted. "Fear keeps you alive, and you are right to be cautious. Men who would kill over land fraud would not hesitate to kill a witness." He was quiet for a moment, thinking, what were the names of these men? "Richard Dalton, Samuel Cross, and a man called Braddock. I do not know his first name." James's expression darkened. "I know those names. Dalton owns the biggest spread in the county. Cross has the land south of here. Braddock runs cattle for both of them, and he has a reputation for being quick with a gun." "So you see why I was afraid," Sarah said. "I do," James agreed. "And you are right to be. But you are safe here, at least for now. This is open country. I can see anyone approaching from a long way off. And I am not without resources of my own." He paused. "How far along are you?" 7 months, Sarah said, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. "The baby should come in December, maybe early January. Then you need to stay here until after the birth," James said decisively. "You cannot be traveling in your condition, and you especially cannot be running. It would be dangerous for both you and the child." "I cannot impose on you for that long," Sarah protested. "You are not imposing," James said. "I am offering. There is plenty of room, and honestly, it will be good to have another person around. This house gets lonely." Sarah wanted to argue, but the truth was she had nowhere else to go. No family, no friends close enough to trust with her life, no money for a hotel even if she dared show her face in town. And the thought of having a safe place to stay until the baby came, of not having to fear and run and hide anymore, was almost too good to believe. "I can help," she said. "I can cook and clean, earn my keep." "If you want to help, I will not stop you," James said, "but it is not required. For now, just rest and regain your strength. We can sort out everything else as we go." The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Sarah did rest at first, spending most of her time in the bedroom or sitting on the porch in the shade, watching the endless prairie grass wave in the wind. James was out most of the day, tending to his cattle and horses, mending fences, and doing the 100 other tasks that kept a ranch running. But he always came back for meals, and gradually Sarah began to help, first with simple things like setting the table and washing dishes, then with cooking and cleaning as her strength returned. James was an easy person to live with. He was quiet but not unfriendly, respectful of her space but willing to talk when she wanted company. He never asked intrusive questions, never made her feel like a burden, and he treated her with a courtesy that felt almost old-fashioned. In the evenings they would sit on the porch, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, and talk about inconsequential things: the weather, the cattle, the hawks that circled overhead. Sarah learned that James had come to Texas from Missouri after his wife died, wanting to start fresh in a place where every corner did not hold a painful memory. He had bought the ranch with money he had saved from years of working as a wrangler, and he had built it up slowly through hard work and careful management. He had few neighbors and fewer friends, preferring the solitude of the prairie to the complications of town life. "Do you ever get lonely?" Sarah asked one evening as they watched the stars come out. "Sometimes," James admitted. "But lonely is better than hurting, and for a long time that was my only choice. Lately, though, it is getting easier. Time does that, I suppose." "I do not think time is going to make this easier," Sarah said quietly. "I loved Thomas. We were going to build a life together, raise our child together. Now he is gone, and I do not even know who I am anymore." "You are a woman who survived," James said firmly. "You are a woman who was brave enough to run when running was the only choice. You are a woman who is going to bring a new life into this world. That is who you are." The words brought tears to Sarah's eyes, but they were not entirely sad tears. There was comfort in them, and a tiny spark of hope that she had not felt since Thomas died. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to feel more like herself again. Her body grew heavier with the advancing pregnancy, but she felt safe enough to stop looking over her shoulder constantly, to sleep through the night without jolting awake at every sound. She took over most of the cooking, enjoying the task and the way James's face would light up when he tasted something particularly good. She mended his clothes, discovering tears and missing buttons that he had never bothered to fix. She organized the house, bringing a woman's touch to the spaces that had been purely functional under his bachelor care. James seemed to appreciate the changes, though he never said much about them directly. Instead, he showed his gratitude in small ways, bringing her wildflowers he found on the range, making sure she had the most comfortable chair by the fire, asking about her comfort and well-being with genuine concern. It was in the middle of October when Sarah realized she was beginning to have feelings for him that went beyond gratitude. She was kneading bread dough at the kitchen table when he came in from the barn, his shirt damp with sweat from mucking out stalls, and she found herself watching the way his muscles moved under the fabric, the strength in his shoulders and arms. He caught her looking and smiled, and she felt her face heat with a blush that had nothing to do with the warm kitchen. That night, lying in bed with her hands on her belly, feeling the baby move inside her, Sarah admitted to herself that she was developing romantic feelings for James Holloway. The realization filled her with confusion and guilt. Thomas had been dead for barely a month. How could she be feeling this way about another man so soon? Was she betraying her husband's memory? Was she being foolish, mistaking gratitude and proximity for something deeper? But when she was honest with herself, she knew it was more than that. James was kind and strong and decent in ways that went bone deep. He had taken her in when she had nothing, asked for nothing in return, treated her with respect and gentleness. He made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since before Thomas died. And more than that, he made her laugh sometimes, made her think about a future that might hold more than just fear and survival. She did not know if he felt the same way. He was always proper with her, never overstepping boundaries, never giving any indication that he saw her as anything more than a woman in need of help. And really, what could he possibly see in her? She was pregnant with another man's child, homeless, possibly being hunted by killers. She was hardly an appealing prospect for a rancher who could have his pick of single women in town if he wanted. The next morning, Sarah was more awkward than usual, self-conscious about her feelings and afraid they might show on her face. James noticed immediately, of course, because he was observant about things like that, but he did not press her about it. He just gave her space and went about his work, and gradually Sarah relaxed again. A week later, James came back from a rare trip to town with supplies and a concerned expression on his face. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she saw him riding up, and something about the set of his shoulders made her stomach clench with anxiety. "What is wrong?" she asked as soon as he dismounted. "Maybe nothing," James said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "But I heard talk in town. Someone has been asking questions about a woman matching your description, a pregnant woman who might have been traveling alone." The blood drained from Sarah's face and she grabbed the fence post to steady herself. "Who was asking?" "A man named Braddock." Sarah's knees went weak and she would have fallen if James had not been there to catch her, his strong arms going around her to hold her up. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows I saw what happened." "We do not know that for certain," James said, though his voice was grim. "Maybe he is just being thorough, but either way you need to stay out of sight. No more working outside where someone might see you from the road. Keep away from the windows when you can." "I have put you in danger," Sarah said, horror washing over her. "I should leave. I should. "You are not going anywhere," James said firmly, his arms still around her. "You are safe here and you are staying here. I am not going to let anyone hurt you or your baby, do you understand me?" Sarah looked up into his face and saw the fierce determination there, the protective instinct that had nothing to do with simple charity and everything to do with something deeper. And in that moment, with his arms around her and his eyes burning with intensity, she knew that her feelings were not one-sided. He cared about her. Maybe he was not ready to admit it, maybe he was fighting it just as hard as she was, but he cared. "I understand," she whispered. They stood there for a long moment, neither of them moving, and then James seemed to realize how close they were and stepped back, his hands dropping from her waist. "I will finish the laundry," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You go inside." Sarah obeyed, her heart pounding, and spent the rest of the afternoon trying to process everything, the fear of being discovered, and the unexpected joy of realizing that James Holloway might care about her as more than just a woman he was helping. That night, James insisted on checking all the doors and windows before bed, and he brought his rifle into the house instead of leaving it in the barn. "Just a precaution," he said when he saw Sarah's worried look. "I do not think anyone knows you are here, but I would rather be prepared." Sarah barely slept that night, startling at every sound, imagining killers creeping through the darkness toward the house. But morning came without incident, and the day after that, and gradually the immediate terror faded into a constant low-level anxiety that became almost normal. Life on the ranch continued, but with new precautions. Sarah stayed inside more, venturing out only when necessary and always with James nearby. He taught her to shoot, taking her behind the barn one afternoon and patiently showing her how to hold the pistol, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. Sarah's first attempts were wildly off target, but James was patient and encouraging, and eventually she managed to hit the tin cans he had set up on the fence posts. "Good," he said with genuine approval. "You have a steady hand. With practice you will be a decent shot." "I do not want to shoot anyone," Sarah said, staring at the gun in her hand with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Neither do I," James replied. "But sometimes wanting and doing are different things, and I would rather you know how to defend yourself if it comes to that." As October turned to November, the weather grew cooler and the prairie grass turned from green to gold to brown. James worked longer hours, preparing the ranch for winter, and Sarah found herself missing his company during the days. She kept busy with household tasks, but it was not the same as having him there to talk to share meals with, to simply be near. The baby was getting bigger, moving constantly now, and sometimes Sarah would sit in the rocking chair that James had brought in from the barn, her hands on her belly, talking to her child about the father he or she would never know. She told stories about Thomas, how they had met at a church social, how he had courted her with shy determination, how happy they had been in their brief marriage. She wanted her child to know that Thomas Montgomery had been a good man, an honest man, even if his honesty had gotten him killed. But she also found herself thinking about James, about the life they were building together in this temporary arrangement that was starting to feel less temporary with each passing day. What would happen after the baby was born? Would she leave, try to make her own way somehow? The thought filled her with a sadness that surprised her with its intensity. One evening in mid-November, as they sat by the fire after supper, James brought up the subject that had been hovering unspoken between them for weeks. "Sarah," he said carefully, "we need to talk about what happens after the baby comes." Sarah's heart sank even as she nodded. "I know, I have been thinking about it too. You are welcome to stay here as long as you need to," James continued. "Longer than that if you want." "I have been thinking," he paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I have been thinking that maybe we could make this arrangement more permanent." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" James stood up and began pacing, clearly uncomfortable but determined to say what he needed to say. "I mean that we could get married. A marriage of convenience, if you want to call it that. It would give you and the baby legal protection, a name, a home. And it would give me, he stopped, running a hand through his hair. It would give me a reason to stop being alone. James, Sarah said softly, her emotions a confused tangle of hope and fear and guilt. I cannot ask you to do that. To take on another man's child, to tie yourself to a woman who is being hunted. You are not asking, James interrupted, turning to face her. I am offering, and as for the child, every baby deserves a father. I could be that if you would let me. I know I cannot replace Thomas, and I would never try to, but I could give you both a safe home, a good life. Is that all this would be? Sarah asked, needing to know, needing to understand what he was really offering. A practical arrangement. James looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, a wall coming down that he had been carefully maintaining. At first, maybe that was what I told myself, he said quietly. That I was just doing the right thing, helping someone in need. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that. Somewhere along the way, I started caring about you, Sarah. Not just about keeping you safe, but about seeing you smile, hearing you laugh, talking to you in the evenings. I am not saying I am in love with you. I am not sure either of us is ready for that yet. But I care about you, and I think maybe with time, it could become something more. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, but they were not entirely sad tears. I care about you too, she admitted. I have been feeling so guilty about it, like I am betraying Thomas's memory by having feelings for someone else so soon. But I cannot help it. You have been so kind, so good to me, and I find myself thinking about you all the time. James crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. You are not betraying anyone, he said firmly. You are surviving, and Thomas would want that. He would want you and his child to be safe and cared for. If that means finding happiness with someone else, so be it. Are you sure about this? Sarah asked. Really sure, because once we do this there is no going back. You would be taking on all of my problems, all of my dangers. I am sure, James said without hesitation. I want this, Sarah, I want you here. I want to build a life with you, to raise your baby as my own, to see what we can become together. Sarah looked into his eyes and saw only honesty and determination and the beginning of something that could, with time and care, grow into love. Then yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you. James smiled, a genuine expression of joy that transformed his usually serious face, and lifted her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. Thank you, he said. I promise I will do everything in my power to make you happy, to keep you safe. I know you will, Sarah said, and she believed it. They were married the following week in the little church where James had first found Sarah, with only the circuit preacher and his wife as witnesses. Sarah wore the best dress she owned, which was not saying much considering she only had the one she had arrived in. But James had surprised her with a length of blue calico fabric, and she had stayed up late for 3 nights in a row sewing it into something presentable. James wore his Sunday suit, the only formal clothing he owned, and he looked handsome and nervous as he stood beside her at the altar. The ceremony was simple and brief, the preacher's words washing over Sarah in a blur of emotion. She repeated her vows in a voice that trembled only slightly, promising to love and honor and cherish this man who had saved her life in more ways than one. When James slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, she felt the weight of it like a promise and a protection. You may kiss your bride, the preacher said, and James turned to her with a question in his eyes, asking permission. Sarah nodded, and he leaned down and kissed her softly, chastely, a gentle press of lips that nonetheless sent warmth flooding through her body. They rode back to the ranch as husband and wife, not saying much but holding hands the whole way. And when they arrived, James carried her over the threshold, even though she laughingly protested that she was too heavy in her pregnant state. Tradition is tradition, he said firmly, setting her down gently in the main room. Then he stood there awkwardly, clearly unsure what came next. James, Sarah said gently, we do not have to rush anything. We can take our time, figure out what this marriage is going to be." Relief washed over his face. "I was hoping you would say that. I do not want you to feel pressured into anything you are not ready for." "I appreciate that," Sarah said, "but I do think we should share the bedroom. We are married now, and besides, it seems silly for you to keep sleeping in the barn when there is a perfectly good bed in here." James looked surprised but pleased. "If you are sure." "I am sure," Sarah said. "But maybe we could put up a curtain or something, give us each a bit of privacy while we adjust." And that was what they did. James strung a curtain across one corner of the bedroom, creating a small space for changing clothes and washing up, and they settled into the strange new intimacy of sharing a room. Those first few nights were awkward, both of them acutely aware of the other's presence, trying to be quiet and respectful. But gradually it became more comfortable, even comforting, to hear the other person breathing in the darkness, to know they were not alone. Winter came to the Texas Panhandle with cold winds and occasional snow, and the ranch took on a different rhythm. There was less work to do outside, which meant James spent more time in the house, and Sarah found herself enjoying his constant presence. They played cards in the evenings, read aloud to each other from the few books James owned, talked about everything and nothing. Sarah's belly grew enormous as the baby prepared for birth, and she became increasingly uncomfortable, her back aching constantly and sleep difficult to come by. James was patient and helpful, bringing her pillows to prop her up, making her tea, rubbing her sore feet without being asked. His tenderness never failed to surprise her, this strong, rough rancher who could be so gentle when the situation called for it. It was on a cold night in late December when Sarah woke to a sharp pain in her belly and the feeling of wetness between her legs. For a moment she was confused, disoriented by sleep, and then realization hit her with the force of a thunderbolt. "James," she said urgently, reaching across the space between them to shake his shoulder. "James, wake up, the baby is coming." James was awake instantly, sitting up and reaching for the lamp. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," Sarah said through gritted teeth as another contraction hit. "My water broke. This is happening." James's face went pale in the lamplight, but his voice was steady when he spoke. All right, we can do this. What do you need me to do?" "Get towels," Sarah said, "and heat water." "And oh God," she broke off as another contraction seized her, stronger than the last. The next few hours were a blur of pain and effort. James stayed with her the whole time, following her instructions, supporting her when she needed to walk, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth during the brief respites between contractions. He never faltered, never showed fear even though Sarah could tell he was terrified, and his presence was the only thing that kept her from panicking as the labor intensified. "I cannot do this," Sarah gasped at one point, exhausted and overwhelmed. "It is too much, I cannot." "Yes, you can," James said firmly, taking her hands and making her look at him. "You are the strongest person I know, Sarah. You survived things that would have broken most people. You can do this. Your baby is almost here, and he was right." Just as dawn was breaking, painting the sky outside the window in shades of pink and gold, Sarah gave one final push and felt the baby slip free of her body. There was a moment of terrifying silence, and then a thin wail filled the room, the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. "It is a boy," James said, his voice thick with emotion as he carefully wrapped the baby in a clean towel and placed him in Sarah's arms. "You have a son." Sarah looked down at the tiny red face, the dark eyes that were trying to focus on her, the perfect miniature fingers that were waving in the air, and she fell completely and utterly in love. "Hello," she whispered to her child. "Hello, little one, I am your mama." James sat beside her on the bed, one arm around her shoulders, looking down at the baby with an expression of wonder. "He is perfect," he said softly. "Absolutely perfect." "Do you want to hold him?" Sarah asked. James hesitated, then carefully took the baby from her arms. He held the child with surprising confidence for someone who claimed to have no experience with infants, cradling the small head in his large hand, and Sarah saw something change in his face. This was the moment, she realized, when James Holloway truly became a father. Not through blood, but through choice. "What will you name him?" James asked. Sarah had been thinking about this for weeks. "Thomas," she said. "For his father, Thomas James, if that is all right with you." James looked at her with eyes that were suspiciously bright. "I would be honored," he said quietly. The weeks after Thomas's birth were exhausting but joyful. Sarah was surprised by how naturally James took to fatherhood, how he would walk the floor with the baby in the middle of the night when Thomas was fussy, how he could change a diaper or warm a bottle without complaint. He clearly loved the child, loved him fiercely and completely, and watching him with their son made Sarah's heart ache with affection. Their relationship deepened during those long winter weeks. The walls between them came down gradually, replaced by real intimacy and understanding. They learned each other's histories, shared their hopes and fears, talked about the future they wanted to build together. And somewhere in the midst of all that talking and sharing, somewhere between the midnight feedings and the quiet moments watching Thomas sleep, Sarah realized she was falling in love with her husband. It was a different kind of love than what she had felt for Thomas Montgomery. That had been the passionate romance of youth, exciting and all-consuming. This was quieter, deeper, built on a foundation of respect and companionship and shared purpose. But it was no less real, no less powerful. She thought James felt it too, saw it in the way his hand would linger on hers when he passed her something, in the way his eyes would seek her out across the room, in the gentle kiss he had started giving her each night before they went to sleep. But neither of them spoke of it directly, as if putting it into words might somehow break the spell. It was in early March, when the prairie was just beginning to show signs of spring, that everything changed. Sarah was in the kitchen making bread while the baby napped when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Multiple horses. Her blood turned to ice and she ran to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see out. 3 men were riding up to the house, and even from a distance, she recognized Richard Dalton's expensive black horse and Samuel Cross's distinctive gray. The 3rd man was Braddock, and he had a rifle across his saddle. James was in the barn, too far away to call without alerting the men to her presence. Sarah's mind raced. She could hide, but the baby was asleep in the bedroom and she could not risk him waking and crying. She could try to run, but they would see her. The only option was to face them and hope that James would hear the commotion and come quickly. She grabbed the pistol that James kept on a high shelf, checked that it was loaded, and positioned herself behind the door just as heavy footsteps sounded on the porch. There was a loud knock, and then Braddock's voice called out, "We know someone is in there. Come out peaceable and nobody gets hurt." Sarah's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the gun. She thought of Thomas, sleeping innocently in his cradle, and of James, who was probably walking into a trap. She thought of everything she had survived to get to this point, and she felt anger replace her fear. She opened the door, keeping the gun pointed at the floor but clearly visible. "What do you want?" The 3 men looked surprised to see a woman, even more surprised to see her armed. Dalton, a tall man with silver hair and cold blue eyes, recovered first. "Mrs. Montgomery, I presume," he said. "We have been looking for you." "I have nothing to say to you," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You murdered my husband." "That was an unfortunate necessity," Dalton said, as if discussing the weather. "He was interfering in business that did not concern him. We hoped you had disappeared into wherever it is widows go, but then we heard rumors of a pregnant woman staying at the Holloway Ranch, and well, we had to investigate." "I do not know what you think I know," Sarah said, "but I know nothing about my husband's work. He never discussed it with me." "I wish I could believe that," Dalton said. "But I cannot take the chance. You see, your husband made copies of certain documents before he died. Documents that would be very inconvenient for us if they ever reached the territorial marshal. We need to know where those documents are." I do not know anything about documents, Sarah said truthfully. Thomas had never mentioned making copies of anything. I think you do, Braddock said, and his hand moved toward his gun. That was when James's voice cut through the tension like a knife. I would not do that if I were you. Everyone turned. James was standing at the corner of the house, his rifle aimed steadily at Braddock. Sarah had never been so happy to see anyone in her life. This does not concern you, Holloway, Dalton said. That is my wife you are threatening, James said calmly. I would say it concerns me very much. Your wife, Cross spoke for the first time, his voice mocking. You married Thomas Montgomery's widow, how convenient. Tell me, were you two carrying on before her husband died? Watch your mouth, James said, his voice going hard and dangerous. Sarah came to me for help and I gave it to her. We were married legal and proper 3 months ago. Now I suggest you get off my property before someone gets hurt. There are 3 of us and 1 of you, Braddock pointed out. True, James agreed. But I am the one with my rifle already aimed and ready. I can drop at least 1 of you before you clear leather, and I will make sure it is you, Braddock, since you are the one who actually pulled the trigger on Thomas Montgomery. There was a long, tense silence. Sarah held her breath, her finger on the trigger of her own gun, ready to shoot if it came to that. Finally, Dalton raised a hand in a calming gesture. There is no need for violence, he said smoothly. We simply came to talk. You have talked, James said. Now leave. We will go, Dalton agreed. But this is not over, Holloway. Sooner or later we will find those documents and anyone who gets in our way will regret it. Is that a threat? James asked. It is a promise, Dalton replied. The 3 men mounted their horses and rode away, but slowly, as if to show they were not afraid. Sarah waited until they were out of sight before she lowered her gun, her hands shaking so badly now that she nearly dropped it. James was at her side immediately, taking the weapon from her and pulling her into his arms. Are you all right? He asked urgently. Did they hurt you? I am fine, Sarah said, her face pressed against his chest. But James, they are not going to stop. They are going to keep coming until they find what they are looking for or... She could not finish the sentence. Then we need to find those documents first, James said grimly. Did Thomas ever mention where he might have hidden them? Sarah pulled back, thinking hard. He never said anything about documents at all, but there was a box, a small wooden box that he kept in his desk at home. He told me never to open it, that it was just old papers from his work. Do you think? I think we need to get that box, James said. Where is your old house? About 15 miles north of Amarillo, Sarah said. But it has been months. Someone else might be living there now, or it might have been ransacked. It is worth checking, James said. We will go tomorrow early before anyone is watching. That night, Sarah could not sleep. She lay in bed listening to Thomas breathing softly in his cradle and James breathing beside her, and she thought about how much she stood to lose. Not just her own life, but the lives of the 2 people she loved most in the world. Because she did love James, she realized. She loved him completely and desperately, and the thought of anything happening to him because of her filled her with terror. I am sorry, she whispered into the darkness. I am sorry I brought this danger to your door. Sarah, James's voice came from beside her, warm and certain. Look at me. She turned toward him, and in the faint moonlight filtering through the window she could see his face, serious and tender at the same time. You did not bring danger here, he said. You brought life. You brought light and warmth and purpose to a house that had been empty for too long. Whatever happens, I will never regret taking you in, never regret marrying you. Do you understand? I love you, Sarah said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I know it is too soon. I know you might not feel the same way, but I need you to know, I love you, James Holloway. James reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb stroking her cheek. It is not too soon, he said quietly. And I do feel the same way. I love you too, Sarah. I think I have loved you for a while now. I was just too stubborn and scared to admit it. He kissed her then, not the chaste goodnight kisses they had been sharing, but a real kiss, deep and hungry and full of all the emotion they had been holding back. Sarah kissed him back with everything she had, pouring all her love and fear and hope into that single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "We are going to get through this," he promised. "We are going to find those documents, clear your name, and build the life we both want. I promise you, Sarah." "I believe you," she said, and she did. They left before dawn the next morning, taking the baby with them because Sarah refused to be separated from him. The ride to her old house was tense and watchful, both of them scanning the horizon constantly for any sign of pursuit. But the land remained empty except for the occasional jackrabbit or hawk, and they reached the small homestead without incident. The house looked abandoned and forlorn, the door hanging loose on its hinges, the windows dark and empty. Sarah's heart clenched at the sight of it, remembering the happy months she and Thomas had spent here, building their home and their future together. Now it was just a shell, haunted by memories and loss. James helped her dismount, taking Thomas from her arms so she could navigate the uneven ground, and they approached the house cautiously. Inside, it was clear that someone had been through the place. Drawers pulled out and overturned, furniture moved, personal belongings scattered. The vandalism made Sarah's chest hurt, but she pushed past the emotion and headed straight for the small room that had served as Thomas's office. The desk was still there, battered but intact. Sarah pulled out the bottom drawer and felt around until her fingers found the small wooden box wedged into the very back. She pulled it out and opened it with trembling hands. Inside were papers, just as she had expected, but they were not old documents from the land office. They were copies, carefully made in Thomas's neat handwriting, of deed registrations and land patents and affidavits. At the bottom of the stack was a letter addressed to the territorial marshal, explaining what Thomas had discovered and providing all the evidence needed to prove fraud. "This is it," Sarah breathed. "This is what they are looking for." "Then we need to get this to the marshal as fast as possible," James said. "Once it is in official hands, you will be safe. They will not dare to come after you when the law knows what they did." They rode hard for the nearest town with a telegraph office, arriving dusty and exhausted in the late afternoon. James sent a telegram to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe, explaining the situation and asking for urgent assistance. The marshal's response came back within an hour. He would arrive in Amarillo within the week to take custody of the evidence and begin an investigation. The week that followed was the longest of Sarah's life. They stayed at a hotel in town, not wanting to be isolated at the ranch where Dalton and his men might come for them. James kept his rifle close at all times and barely slept, staying alert for any sign of danger. Sarah clutched Thomas to her chest and tried not to think about all the ways this could still go wrong. But the marshal arrived as promised, a stern-faced man named Harrison who listened to Sarah's story with grave attention and examined the documents with a practiced eye. He asked detailed questions, took statements, and assured them that Dalton, Cross, and Braddock would be arrested immediately. "What you have done is brave, Mrs. Holloway," Marshal Harrison said as he prepared to leave. "These men have been stealing land from honest homesteaders for years, and no one has been able to prove it until now. Your husband was a hero, and so are you." Sarah did not feel like a hero. She felt tired and scared and relieved beyond measure that it was finally over. But she thanked the marshal and watched him ride away with the evidence that would bring her husband's killers to justice. The arrests happened swiftly. Dalton, Cross, and Braddock were taken into custody and charged with murder and fraud. The trial, when it came several months later, was a sensation. Sarah had to testify about the morning she witnessed Thomas's murder, had to relive the horror of watching her husband die, but James sat beside her in the courtroom and held her hand through all of it. In the end, all three men were convicted. Braddock was sentenced to hang for murder, while Dalton and Cross received long prison terms. With the threat finally eliminated, Sarah and James returned to the ranch and to the life they had been building together. Sarah was free now, free to use her real name, free to live without fear, free to love her husband openly and without reservation. The seasons turned and life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Sarah thrived in her role as wife and mother, finding joy in the simple tasks of running a household and raising her son. Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler, beginning to walk and talk, his father's dark eyes and serious expression marking him as Thomas Montgomery's child even as he called James Papa and followed him everywhere. James was a wonderful father, patient and loving and endlessly engaged with his son. He taught Thomas to ride almost as soon as the boy could walk, holding him safely on the saddle in front of him and pointing out the different animals and plants of the prairie. He read to him every night before bed, his deep voice bringing life to the simple stories. He praised every small achievement and comforted every scraped knee with equal measure of enthusiasm and tenderness, and he was an equally wonderful husband. He loved Sarah with a quiet intensity that showed itself in 1,000 small ways: the coffee he made for her every morning, the wildflowers he still brought her from the range, the way he would pull her into his arms for no reason except that he wanted to hold her. Their physical relationship deepened and grew, becoming another language for expressing the love they felt for each other. 2 years after Thomas was born, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. James was overjoyed at the news, picking her up and spinning her around despite her laughing protests that she was not a sack of flour. This time there was no fear attached to the pregnancy, only anticipation and excitement. Their second child, a daughter they named Elizabeth Rose, was born on a warm day in June. She came into the world with a lusty cry that proclaimed her strong personality, and she had James wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment she opened her bright blue eyes and looked at him. Thomas, now a sturdy 3-year-old, was fascinated by his new sister and insisted on helping with everything, from fetching diapers to singing her lullabies in his childish voice. The years that followed were full and happy. The ranch prospered under James's careful management, and they were able to expand, buying more land and building a larger house to accommodate their growing family. A third child came, another boy they named William, and then a fourth, a daughter named Grace. The house that had once been so quiet and lonely was now filled with the sounds of children laughing and playing, with the chaos and joy of family life. Sarah sometimes thought about Thomas Montgomery, about the life they had planned together that had been cut so tragically short. She kept his memory alive for their son, telling stories about his father's honesty and bravery, making sure young Thomas knew he came from good stock. But her heart belonged completely to James now, to the man who had saved her when she had nothing and loved her when she had every reason to doubt that happiness was possible. James never treated young Thomas differently from the other children. He loved all 4 of them equally and completely, and if anyone in town remembered that the oldest boy was not his by blood, they knew better than to mention it. As far as James was concerned, Thomas was his son in every way that mattered, and he would fight anyone who suggested otherwise. One evening, when Sarah was 35 and James was 40, they sat on the porch of their house watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The children were inside, supposedly doing their homework but more likely causing some kind of mischief, and for a moment it was just the 2 of them as it had been in those early days. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked, leaning against James's shoulder. "Taking me in that day? Your life would have been so much simpler if you had just left me in that church." James wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "You and the children are the best things that ever happened to me. That day I found you hiding in the church was the day my real life began." "Mine too," Sarah said softly. "I was so scared and alone, and you gave me everything. A home, a family, a future. You gave me love when I thought I would never feel that way again." "That baby deserved a home," James said, echoing the words he had spoken all those years ago. "And you deserved a chance at happiness. I am just grateful you let me be part of it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. From inside the house came the sound of children's laughter, the clatter of dishes, the ordinary sounds of a life well lived. Sarah thought about the terrified pregnant woman who had hidden in a church, certain she had no future worth having. She thought about the lonely cowboy who had found her there and offered her hope. She thought about all the years in between, the struggles and the triumphs, the fears overcome and the love discovered. "I love you," she said, turning to kiss James's weathered cheek. "I will love you for the rest of my life." "And I love you," James replied, his eyes soft in the gathering darkness. "Forever, Sarah. Forever." As if on cue, the door burst open and their children spilled out onto the porch, Thomas and William wrestling good-naturedly, while Elizabeth and Grace ran to their parents demanding bedtime stories. James laughed and scooped Grace into his lap, while Sarah pulled Elizabeth close. And together they shepherded their family inside for the evening rituals that marked the end of another day. Later that night, after the children were all asleep and the house was quiet, Sarah lay in bed beside her husband, listening to his steady breathing and thinking about how lucky she was. She had survived loss and fear and danger, had found love in the most unexpected place, had built a life richer and fuller than anything she could have imagined in those dark days after Thomas Montgomery's death. The baby that had needed a home had that home now, and 3 siblings to go with it. The frightened woman who had hidden in a church had become a confident wife and mother, secure in the love of her husband and family. The lonely cowboy who had taken a chance on a stranger had found the companionship and purpose he had been missing for so long. It was not the life any of them had planned, but it was a good life. It was a life built on kindness and courage, on second chances and new beginnings, on the understanding that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places. And as Sarah drifted off to sleep with James's arm around her, and the sound of her children breathing softly down the hall, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the people she was meant to be with, living exactly the life she was meant to live. The years continued to unfold with the gentle rhythm of ranch life. Young Thomas grew into a serious, intelligent young man with his late father's sense of honor and his adopted father's practical wisdom. At 18, he announced his intention to study law, wanting to fight injustice the way his birth father had tried to do. James and Sarah were immensely proud, and they sent him off to study in Santa Fe with tears in their eyes and confidence in their hearts. William proved to have a gift with horses, able to gentle even the most spirited animal with patience and understanding. At 16, he was already helping James train the ranch horses, and neighbors from miles around would bring their difficult mounts to the Holloway Ranch for William's special touch. Elizabeth inherited her mother's practical nature and her father's business sense, and at 14, she was already keeping the ranch books with an accuracy that impressed everyone who saw them. She had plans to expand the ranch's operations, ideas about breeding programs and market strategies that James listened to with respectful attention. Grace, the youngest at 12, was the dreamer of the family. She loved to read and write, filling notebooks with stories and poems, and she had announced her intention to become a teacher so she could help other children discover the magic of words. Sarah watched her children grow with a mixture of pride and bittersweet awareness that they would not stay children forever. But she had James, and their love had only deepened with time, becoming the bedrock on which everything else was built. They still sat on the porch most evenings, still held hands across the dinner table, still found time to be alone together despite the demands of running a ranch and raising a family. One spring morning, when wildflowers were blooming across the prairie and the air smelled of fresh grass and possibility, James took Sarah riding to a hilltop that overlooked their land. From there, they could see the house they had built together, the barn and corrals, the cattle grazing peacefully, the line of trees they had planted along the creek to provide shade in summer. "Look at what we made," James said, gesturing at the vista spread before them. "Not just the ranch, but the life, the family, everything. We did make something good, did we not?" Sarah agreed, leaning against him. "That scared woman in the church and that lonely cowboy in his empty house. Look at what we became. You know what the best part is?" James said, tilting her face up to look at him. "We are not done yet. We still have years ahead of us, years to watch our grandchildren grow, years to keep building this life together." "Grandchildren," Sarah laughed. "You are getting ahead of yourself. None of them are even married yet." "Thomas has been writing to that girl he met in Santa Fe," James pointed out with a grin. "I would not be surprised if we hear some interesting news within the year. And William has been making excuses to ride over to the Johnson Ranch rather frequently lately, and I do not think it is the cattle that interest him." Sarah shook her head, but she was smiling. "You are probably right. Time moves so fast. Sometimes I can hardly believe it has been almost 20 years since that September day when you found me in the church." "Best day of my life," James said simply. "Well, one of them. The day we got married was pretty good too, and the births of all the children. And really, most of the days in between." "Smooth talker," Sarah teased, but her eyes were warm with love. They sat on the hilltop for a long time, watching the clouds drift across the vast Texas sky, secure in the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. The frightened, pregnant woman hiding in a church had found not just a home but a true partner in life. The lonely cowboy had discovered that healing was possible, that love could come again, that family was something you chose as much as something you were born into. Years later, when Sarah was an old woman with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes, sitting on that same porch surrounded by grandchildren clamoring for stories, she would tell them about the day a cowboy found their grandmother hiding in a church and said that her baby deserved a home. She would tell them about fear and courage, about loss and healing, about the unexpected ways that love could transform a life. And she would look across the porch at her husband, still strong despite the years, still looking at her with the same mixture of tenderness and devotion that he had shown her since the beginning. And she would know that every moment of fear, every hardship endured, every tear shed had been worth it to arrive at this place of peace and plenty. The story that had started with blood and death and desperate flight had become a story of life and hope and enduring love. The baby who deserved a home had grown into a man of honor and integrity, had married and had children of his own, had built a good life on the foundation his parents, both of them, had given him. And all around him, his brothers and sisters had done the same, creating a legacy of love and strength that would extend for generations. As the sun set on another day in the life of the Holloway family, Sarah Holloway closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer of gratitude. For James, who had saved her, for her children and grandchildren who had filled her life with joy, for the second chance she had been given when all seemed lost, for the love that had sustained her through everything and had only grown stronger with time. The Wild West was a hard land that demanded strength and courage from everyone who lived there. It took much and gave back only to those who were willing to fight for what they wanted. Sarah had fought, and she had won. She had survived loss and found love, had built something lasting and beautiful out of the ashes of tragedy. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not the hardship that had brought her to James's door, but the life they had created together. Not the fear that had driven her to hide in a church, but the courage that had allowed her to accept help and eventually open her heart again. Not the death of the past, but the vibrant, thriving life of the present and future. When Sarah Montgomery Holloway finally passed away in her sleep at the age of 78, she was surrounded by the people she loved most in the world. James held her hand, his own eyes dim with age but still bright with love for the woman who had been his partner for over 50 years. Her children and grandchildren filled the room, their presence a testament to the life she had lived and the legacy she left behind. James followed her just 6 months later, his heart finally giving out after so many years of steady beating. His last words were of her, of the love they had shared, of his gratitude for the life they had built together. And those who were with him at the end said he died with a smile on his face, as if he could already see her waiting for him on the other side. They were buried side by side on the hilltop where they had so often sat together, looking out over the land they had loved and the family they had raised. The headstone bore both their names and a simple inscription. They gave each other home. Young Thomas, now a distinguished judge with grandchildren of his own, stood at their graves on the day of his adopted father's burial, and told the assembled family the story one more time. The story of a frightened pregnant woman hiding in a church, and a lonely cowboy who had said that her baby deserved a home. The story of how that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that had sustained two people through a lifetime and created a family that would endure for generations to come. What my parents had, Thomas told his family, his voice thick with emotion, was rare and precious. They found each other in the darkest of times, and they chose to build something beautiful together. They showed all of us what love really means, not just romance or passion, though they had both of those, but partnership and commitment and the daily choice to honor and cherish each other no matter what came. He looked around at the faces of his siblings, his children, his grandchildren, and his nieces and nephews, seeing the legacy of Sarah and James Holloway reflected in every one of them. They were ranchers and lawyers, teachers and doctors, artists and business people. They were honest and hardworking, kind and courageous, the kind of people who made the world better just by being in it. And they were that way because of the example set by the woman who had hidden in a church and the man who had given her hope. Let us honor their memory, Thomas said, by living the way they lived, by choosing love over fear, by offering help to those who need it, by building something good and lasting in this world. That is what they would want. That is the best way we can thank them for everything they gave us. As the family dispersed, heading back to the ranch house for the gathering that would follow the funeral, the sun broke through the clouds that had covered the sky all day, sending shafts of golden light across the prairie. And if you believed in such things, you might have imagined you could see two figures standing on that hilltop, holding hands and looking out over the land they had loved, together for all eternity as they had been in life. The story of Sarah and James Holloway became a legend in their family, passed down from generation to generation, a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simplest acts of kindness, that a home is not just a building but a feeling of safety and belonging. That family is not just blood, but choice and commitment and love given freely, without expectation of return. And somewhere in a small church on the Texas prairie, where a frightened woman once hid and a kind man found her, the wind whispers through the rafters, telling the story to anyone who will listen. The story of how a cowboy gave a home to a baby who deserved one, and in doing so found a home for his own lonely heart. The story of how fear became courage, how loss became love, how desperation became hope, and how two broken people became whole together. It is a story of the Wild West, of hard times and harder choices, of violence and injustice and the people who stood against them. But more than that, it is a love story, pure and simple. The kind of love story that reminds us that even in the darkest times, even when all seems lost, there is still room for kindness, for compassion, for connection. There is still the possibility of finding love in unexpected places, of building a life worth living from the rubble of everything that came before. And that, in the end, is what makes it a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the generations. Because we all need to believe that such love is possible, that such redemption is within reach, that such happiness can emerge from such pain. We need to believe that somewhere out there, there might be someone waiting to say those magical words. You deserve a home. Let me give you that. Sarah and James Holloway proved that such love is not just possible but transformative, not just healing but generative, capable of creating something that will last long after we are gone. They took a moment of crisis and turned it into a lifetime of joy. They took two broken hearts and made them whole. They took a baby who deserved a home and gave him not just shelter but love, not just family but legacy, not just survival but a life rich with meaning and purpose. And really, what more could anyone ask from a love story than that?